Hey, good evening, everybody. This is Nevin, your host of the Politically Homeless podcast. With me is one of my recurring guests, who's a friend of the show, Mr. Charles Daniels of the Communication Workers of America in Michigan, and also the proprietor of the Putting Workers First, which used to be, what was it, American Workers First at one time. And
yeah, for years.
Yeah, so more or less the same message, just a different title. Charles, before we go on, what's your official position in the Michigan State Communication Workers of America again?
I'm staff rep for District 4. I'm a senior campaign lead for District 4.
Okay, great. Alrighty. Well, thank you so much for joining us again, Charles. Charles, we had an election, didn't we? And the American
yeah, we sure did.
And the American people made a selection, at least roughly about half of them. What does this mean for labor? Now that we have Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Republican-dominated Senate, and a Republican-dominated House, and a Supreme Court that's dominated by pro-corporate Federalist Society judges that are not all too friendly to organized labor. So where do we go from here?
That's such a multifaceted question, right? But I think that your instincts on that, talking about the Supreme Court right there, are on point, because I think the biggest fear for labor has to do with the National Labor Relations Board being under siege. And I think there was just an article that was put out by the Washington Post that Trump was saying, yeah, it's in my sights, and they want to have it declared unconstitutional. And that's been the law of the land for the past 85 years. It's what protects workers. It's what gives you an outlet. So that there's impropriety at work, you can take it to the board, and there's an arbiter that can actually look at things and render a ruling. If that goes away because they want it to be declared unconstitutional, the billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are putting all their resources into trying to undo it. And if that goes away, I don't know what happens, Nevin. I will say this, that everything pertaining to workers and striking and the rules that surround that, the National Labor Relations Act, that's what governs that as well. So be careful what you ask for, because if you say that the board is unconstitutional, the act is unconstitutional, and it all goes away, well, then secondary strike, ancillary strike, all those strikes, it's like the Wild West at that point. So I have no idea how that is all going to land. My gut would say that it won't be good for workers, because it never is.
No, it won't be. It's, I mean, why? There's so many questions I have to ask. Why did so many workers, at least seems like, why did so many urban workers, rural Americans, Rust Belt Americans vote for Donald Trump, knowing that his first administration had appointees to the National Labor Relations Board that was hostile to labor, whereas he passed tax laws and deregulation that was not friendly to labor and the consumer. All of these things. And now we know, of course, when Trump had discussion on X, formerly known as Twitter, with Elon Musk, bragging about how they disliked unions and how they broke up strikes, particularly in the case of Elon Musk, and firing people. When you have Vivek Ramaswamy, and who is also hostile to organized labor, as far as I know, he's bringing in many, many people that are hostile to organized labor. Now, I know there are some Trump allies and nonpartisan leaders like Sean O'Brien of the Teamsters. They're really trying to put, I forget the lady's name, in as a more sympathetic Secretary of Labor. I mean, I have no word on that. J.D. Vance supposedly was somewhat friendly to organized labor and labor in general, although he's on record as opposing the PRO Act, which both you and I support. I mean, I would just go further and just say right to work laws, Section 14B of Taft-Hartley, should just be repealed, period. But I got to be honest with you, I don't have a lot of hope in the Trump administration. But the other hand, if these attacks are made against organized labor, it could potentially give a new lease of life in the labor movement. It'll push, I think, organized labor in such a direction that it will be like, okay, we have to go back to square B. And I think we could see, for better or for worse, a new militance in organized labor. Now, what are your thoughts about what I just said? Any reflections or comments on that?
Yeah, and I think all of these things are definitely important, and I think all of them matter. But I want to preface it with this because I've done a ton of reflection and digging after this election because I just wanted to try to understand what was like not understandable for me. It just didn't make sense that people would support this person. So I started looking and I thought about the fact that it wasn't too many months ago. I was talking to my friends over in the UK and they just had a giant swing where the Labour Party did so well over there. They swept all the Tories out who had been in power for a really long time. And we thought, oh, this is great. Look how strong Labor is when we have this election. We're gonna roll on that right there. But that wasn't what actually happened. And when I started looking deeper, when it came to all the post-COVID elections, because COVID was such a monstrosity on the global world, the post-elections, the group that was in power lost the next election cycle. Let me read you out some lists here, all right? And whether they were left or right, they lost. These are places where it flipped, all right? Argentina, the UK, New Zealand, India, France, Japan, South Korea, the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Israel, and now the United States. So I really think that the main thing that went wrong in this election was that COVID made everything so tremendously difficult for people. And when things are hard, people just want change. And I think that's what this vote was about, is they didn't want the people that were in power to continue because they blamed them for what happened. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that I think we need to be a little bit gentle with ourselves on this one. And it's just more of a symptom of what the world was going through more than a referendum on like the people. That makes sense?
Yeah, it partially does. Do you think the inflation had anything to do with, because really the prices and the cost of living, especially depending on what state you live in, has not gone down for Americans. And even though wages have gone up, it has not kept up with the cost of rising prices. And we know, and it's, by the way, it's available on it will be available on my Substack page, Wilderness of Mirrors, and I have a multi-part series called The Hard Truth of Capitalism and Why We Should Still Support Capitalism. And I talk about how much of this inflation and the price rises is actual price gouging. And in some cases, executives as well as the business press has admitted that. In fact, Jamie Dimon, for example, as you know, in the banking industry, had famously stated he does the inflation dance. He prays for inflation, because it's better for his bottom line. So, I think a lot of this also had to do with is that the reforms were really not pushed enough, and you had a Senate where some Democrats undermined a more populist and pro-labor agenda, notably Kristen Sinema of Arizona and Joe Manchin of West Virginia. There were a lot of other problems too as well. I think there's an issue of wealthy donors having tremendous control over both major political parties. You had Chris Cuomo, for example, very well-known broadcaster, pointed at the Democratic National Convention, pointed it up to the boxes in the arena and said, pointed to these wealthy donors, these fat cats, if you want to call them as such, to use the colloquial expression. He said, these are the people that are really controlling things behind the scene. And, I think there were many, many reasons, but I think this is going to have to be a new lease of life on the Democratic Party. So where do you think the Democrats went wrong, or do you feel they didn't go wrong? How do you think that they should have met these challenges with the difficulties of COVID, inflation, price gouging, really this trifecta. And certain state governors have not necessarily made things better either. Notably, I live in Florida with Governor Ron DeSantis. Now, there are some things I agree with Governor DeSantis. Look, I'm politically homeless. I mean, so I attack both sides. You know, I'm not beholden to any party, union, group. I don't get any funding at all whatsoever. I do not make money at this time from this program, so I am serving nobody. With that stated, though, Governor DeSantis, with his deregulation of property insurance, homeowners insurance, that has not made things better. The cost of living has skyrocketed tremendously in Florida. I was just talking with a policeman who's retiring next year, and he won't retire in Florida. He's going to Texas, where the cost of living is much less than Florida. So as many people are moving into Florida, and that was because of COVID. It was trending before for decades. Florida is a Sunbelt state, but many right-wing people were moving from blue states in the Midwest and California and elsewhere to Florida, and that caused a supply and demand issue for housing. And here we are. So where did the Democrats go wrong? What did the Republicans do right? And what should the Democrats do moving forward, since there's really no hope with the Republicans? There are some pockets, by the way, of pro-labor Republicans. I've had them on my show, parts of Minnesota, who are really good. But in many parts of the country, the Republican Party is unfortunately like the bourbon Democrats of the South after the Civil War, minus the racism and all the rest of it. Where did the Democrats go from here? What should they do? Because the party is now experiencing a civil war, from what I see.
Yeah, so this was a Herculean task given the circumstances, but I think where they went wrong is the message that, hey, inflation is down. But when people went to the store, prices didn't go down because, as you mentioned, they didn't reduce, right? From what my understanding, what I've read about, there's about a 20% rise in costs these past 4 years. And folks like our age have never experienced that. This generation, you have to be like 60 years old to have lived through that kind of inflation where you were actually an adult. So it was so new to all of this, and it was so painful, and it hurt. And this messaging of, oh, you know, now inflation is under control and the stock market is up and unemployment is down. And like, Nevin, that's the stuff that we criticized the Trump administration for last time, telling people that life is good because of these things right there. You know, it's not. It's more and more difficult every single day for these people to just exist. And that's something that has trended that way for 40 plus years, really, where Reagan brought in supply side economics, and all of a sudden income inequality started to split, and it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. So I think where the Democrats went wrong is they didn't call out what the culprit of that is. And to me, that is the fact that we've become a corporatocracy, that these corporations have so much power and influence. It's been 40 plus years since we've broken up a monopoly. Ma Bell was the last monopoly that we've broken up. You're telling me there's no other monopolies that exist? I can walk down the grocery store aisle and look at the cereal that's there, and like 3 companies own every single one of the cereals that's on the shelves. So if you have that level of control, you can stack prices. And that means if this one goes up, this one goes up. There's no actual competition. The free market does not exist any longer. It's been bought and paid for. And until we have a message that says, hey, you're being cheated by someone, because the other side's message is very clear. Immigrants have taken things from you. They're the problem. There's someone to blame. And we need to point out the fact that these corporations are the ones that have taken something from you. They're making record profits. I've read that 53 cents of every dollar of inflation was corporate price gouging. They've made money off of this, obscene amounts of money, but they don't call that out because here's the ugly truth. The Democratic Party is extremely beholden to those big corporate donors, just like the Republican Party is. They pay everyone. And until we address the money in politics, I don't know if you can fix that. I mean, goodness, I think they spent something like $15 billion this election season. It's just, it's insane, and it's going to get worse and worse, and they get longer and longer. And Nevin, I am fearful that it's not going to be long before it's just 24/7 election talk, that there is no break between any of this, because it is so much money being generated, and the rewards on it are so good. You look at someone like Elon Musk, who spent, who knows, $130 million, but what's his return on that? Probably billions.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's a big fear of mine is we are in a corporatocracy, and we have been creeping along that path for quite some time, unfortunately. I think, I mean, if you want to know what I think the parties are going to have to split, to be honest, both sides. I think if portions of true blue MAGA populists and nationalists, they see that Trump, I predict, frankly, that Trump is going to betray key portions of his vision, just like he did to a larger degree in 2016. And I supported Trump. I don't know if you knew that. I supported him in 2015, 2016, publicly, I might add. But in areas he disappointed me. Now, there are other things, and you and I may disagree on this. There are things I agreed with his first administration on. But the other 75% was so poor or awful that I really just, could no longer support him. And I was not a supporter of Joe Biden when Herschel was my co-host, and now he's taken on a lot of different projects. His family has expanded and everything else. Him and I were railing against Biden. We did not like Biden at all. And to tell you the truth, Kamala was not great in many ways. We need somebody who is a hardcore pro-labor populist who is still pro-free enterprise. But you need a new FDR for domestic economic policies. That's really the bottom line. And the Democratic Party moving forward needs to encourage younger people in the party who are normie, everyday Americans who are not going to turn off older and younger normie Americans. No Democratic Socialists of America, no pink hair, no, they have to be, in my opinion, everyday cops, military, steel workers, coffee baristas, bartenders, waiters, waitresses, teachers, librarians. You get my point. They have to be nurtured, because let me tell you, there are very bright people I come across, even in my workplace. And I generally don't talk partisan politics in my workplace, other than with maybe one or two, maybe two trusted people. The very bright people, very, very bright people out there in everyday America. I mean, yes, I'll throw in even small businesses and entrepreneurs. But no offense, I've had enough of lawyers and big business people and private equity people like Glenn Youngkin and others dominating. And I have nothing against wealthy people and billionaires by the fact that they're billionaires. But when you have somebody, let's say, like Elon Musk, who is extremely anti-labor, he admires China's authoritarian controlled labor force and condemns American workers as lazy and entitled. When Elon Musk pledges fealty to China's core socialist values, I'm sorry, these people should not have an outside role or domination in American politics. They deserve a seat at the table, but they shouldn't monopolize the whole dinner table of politics and policy making. So I think there's hope with that. There are some forces emerging in the Republican Party and in Conservative Incorporated, like Oren Cass of American Compass. You have Compact Magazine of Saurabh Amari, who eventually I'm going to have on this show, who are trying to push more of a pro-New Deal or American School of Economics and pro-labor position within the Republican Party. We had Jacob Geese, who was one of the media directors in one of the state of Minnesota county level Republican parties. And the Republican Party in the Iron Range of Minnesota is very anti-right to work. They're very pro-labor, but they're also conservative. And I suspect in other parts of different states, we have this. But those voices need to be nurtured in the Republican Party more. But I think the Democratic Party, there needs to be nurturing more normie people. Doesn't mean I hate people with pink hair and all the rest of it or whatnot. No. But it's the hard truth that in rural America and even with urban workers in the Rust Belt, they tend to be culturally conservative. And the Republican Party, since the days of Ronald Reagan, when Lee Atwater was advising his campaign. You can find the memos. They're on the Reagan Library website. And in upcoming essays for my Substack page, I'm going to be covering some of it and quoting it. They use divide and conquer. Just like totalitarian political movements have done divide and conquer, like the German National Socialists, the Communist Party of the United States, and the global communist movement, even today, they use divide and conquer. And the same thing with conservatism incorporated in the Republican Party. And that Lee Atwater under Reagan's campaign started that. They literally said, guys, we're not going to convince the Birmingham, Alabama steelworker or the waitress somewhere else in Illinois that supply side economics and tax cuts for the wealthy are going to benefit them. So we're not going to get the populist vote this way. What we will get the populist vote on is on culture issues, whether it's LGBTQ plus, law and order, things of that nature. And that's what they chose. So while the Democrats moved more to the left on social cultural issues, law enforcement, even some national defense issues, and they moved way to the left, they lost a lot of that culturally conservative populist voter that was on our side economically. And I think the Democrats need to have a big tent where they can accommodate people with different social cultural views. You're going to have the evangelical Christians. You are going to have the LGBTQ people. You're going to have the women of different walks of life. You are going to have, yes, wealthy people, but it's going to have to be a big tent. And each party on even the county and town and city level has to be reworked and tailored according to local needs. You know, they might disagree with abortion, which is another wedge issue. And in another area, the Democratic Party might be more accepting of people that are pro-choice or pro-abortion or whatever you want to call it. I know my audience is divided on that issue. And it's a hard truth. Because if we really want to get the pre-Reagan capitalist order back where labor had a fairer shake, we have to make some real hard changes. And otherwise, we're seriously going to go back to an unvarnished Gilded Age plutocracy. Just like you have the anti-capitalist revolutionaries of fascism and communism, which exists today, got the rise of Russia, China, they're meeting and nurturing more and more Americans and everything, blah, blah, blah. That represents one form of dictatorship. But trust me, if people like Elon Musk and others, in my opinion, if they wanted to do what they really wanted, they would have no problem dusting off a private security force. And if people are striking, they would have no problem committing violence against them. Look at what goes on in Tesla's factories, for example. I mean, the horrific working conditions, allegedly, at least according to former workers who have spoken out. You look at how many of these multi-billionaires praise communist China. Literally. I mean, if that doesn't tell you something, I don't know what will. So that's a concern of mine. I think these people are restrained really by the laws that we do have, however weakened they are over the past several decades. So, that's my response. I have some cautious optimism, but I have grave, grave concerns. Now, getting back to those solutions for the Democrats, you feel free to disagree with me. I know what I'm saying is very controversial, but could you add anything as to what the Democrats really need to do moving forward? Because you hit the nail on the head with what they did wrong. And it also did not help that Biden was refused to bow out of the campaign until literally not even a few months before. That did not help Kamala. Whether you like Kamala or not, that was not fair to her. And then she kind of shifted back and forth. She started, and I'm not saying I support her or Trump, I'm just saying what my observation. She started to make some populist noises. We can debate the sincerity of this or not. Tim Walz was far more consistently pro-labor and had a record in Minnesota of that. But she had 4 months to campaign. She quickly dropped anti-price gouging. I'm not for price controls. There's a difference between price controls, which I generally don't support, because I am more of a free market kind of guy, with, of course, exceptions. But she dropped the anti-price gouging campaign. She really dropped that rhetoric. She brought a lot of pro-corporate people and corporate people. She was constantly talking to Mark Cuban every week. That's known fact about economic policy. And she had a lot of the Obama neoliberal holdovers from, like, Tony West, was legal counsel for Google, who was also, not Google, Uber. She had all kinds of big tech people on her side too as well. And it also didn't help her rhetoric against tariffs too as well. That's not what Rust Belt people want to hear. So when you basically say that it rightfully or wrongfully that it's sales taxes, and you work in a steel mill or in an auto plant that's getting battered for decades by imports, you want relief for your company, so it ensures job security. And lastly, she also kept Tim Walz in the basement. And if we were to believe the video that we saw on More Perfect Union, where Tim Walz actually sat down, talked with Trump, working class and middle class Trump voters, and converted them based on the data, as well as his likable personality, whether you agree with him, liked him or not, he comes across as a likable person. That's where really I think Kamala messed up. And I think she was also partially handed a bad situation. And Trump is an amazing campaigner. He is very good at campaigning. Even with his things that comes out of his mouth that make you scratch your head, he still is a vigorous campaigner. And that's kind of my conclusion. But moving to my point, what do you think the Democrats should do? Do you think they should make some of those hard choices of really getting this grand tent of having a grab bag like a jar of jelly beans? You're going to have the Christians, you're going to have the atheists, you're going to have the pro-abortion, the anti-abortion people. I think they got to focus on one very pro-labor, populist, but still pro-free enterprise message, to the exclusion of everything else. And maybe they need to do a class-based thing, not necessarily socialistic, but like really do what Bernie Sanders does or did in his 2 campaigns, and what he continues to do in the Senate, without saying I'm for nationalizing all the companies. I mean, am I making sense? I'm sorry I'm long-winded. I just want to give my counterpoints and stuff like that.
Yeah, so that's a lot to unpack. That's like 10 minutes to unpack there, Nevin. So I will do my best. where I think that they went wrong. Well, for one, as you mentioned, Kamala Harris was dealt a rough hand because Joe Biden waited till the 11th hour to pull out, and she only had 100 days. There was not a primary in there that was held against us vigorously. If at the start of the year he had said that I'm not going to seek another term and we had had a primary, I think that she very well could have come out of it as the winner, because I'm a huge Kamala Harris fan and I'm a huge Biden fan in regards to his policies. When you look at what he did for those 4 years, no one alive has seen a more pro-labor president than Joe Biden. When you look at his judicial appointments, when you look at what he did in raising federal minimum wages, when you look what he did when he first active president to ever walk a picket line, I mean, Joe Biden can take the Pepsi challenge with anyone. And Kamala Harris was right there with him through the entire administration in lockstep with them. So I was so excited to have 4 more years of Kamala Harris as the president, just because I knew that we'd be getting that Biden administration labor policy. And maybe she didn't do a good enough job ballyhooing that and talking about it. But at the rallies that I was at, because I did get to see her speak at Labor Day, she absolutely talked about unions and labor, and that when we all do better, we all do better. She used that messaging, but unfortunately, it doesn't really resonate with folks the way that it did before. And when it comes to the populist language, Trump is so good at using it. Let me give an example of why it's bullshit, though. One of his big things was no tax on tips, right? Which Kamala Harris also said, no tax on tips, but Trump got out there first with it. But in 2017, while Trump was president, his Department of Labor tried to change an Obama era law that would have said if you're a tipped worker that makes minimum wage, the company can take those extra tips and use them in any way they want. They can give them to other workers, they can split them, they can just put them in their pockets. Anyone watching this, go check the receipts. 2017, they tried to pass it. Did not work. Congress passed a law that said, no, those tips belong to those workers. So tell me, Nevin, if someone tells you, I believe on no tax on tips, but on the other hand, when they were president of the United States of America, their administration tried to change the law so that the owners would be able to take the tips that were given to you, would you believe that they actually cared about you? Absolutely not. And the same thing, the populist message of no tax on overtime, that is great messaging. I don't know how they possibly beat us to the punch on that. But when you look at Project 2025, page 592, the changes they want to make with overtime laws, where instead of having a 40-hour work week, you'll have a 160-hour work month, so they can load you up on hours the first 2 weeks and then not have you work the last 2 weeks so they don't have to pay you overtimes. I don't believe him. I think it is a lie. I think he is a chicken hawk. And I think people are going to find that out quickly, because in his administration, the first time around, the only thing he really did was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. And what that did is it put a lot of money in rich folks' hands. That money did not trickle down. It went to stock buybacks. It went to shareholders. It went to the 1%. And at some point, you have to call that out vigorously. Just vigorously, and you have to lay it on the table. The hard part with this, Nevin, is it is so difficult to combat a lie. The lies just take off like wildfire, where the truth is so hard to explain because you got to look at the why behind something. When they look at the tariffs, it's common sense that if you make something more expensive to the companies, it will become more expensive to the consumers. That is a fact of economics. But we kept some of those tariffs, right? So why did we do that? Because tariffs aren't inherently bad. If you want to protect one of your industries, like the Chips and Science Act is trying to do, what our manufacturers are trying to do with the EVs, if you want to tariff those so that you protect those industries, it makes total sense to do it. Where it doesn't make sense is telling someone that we're going to get back into the manufacturing of plastics economy, or we're going to be able to compete with Bangladesh when it comes to tanneries. The labor laws there, how much they pay the people, and the environmental regulations that they have are non-existent because they poison the shit out of their environments. That is never coming back. So if you tariff those things, if you tax those things, all it's going to do is pass those costs along to the consumers. But it takes time to explain that, and people don't want to hear it. I can just get up there and I can say these little things that, they're going to do this and they're going to do that, and it's going to do these things. And it's so hard to fact check them because it takes someone wanting to understand what's going on. And people are too busy. They're tired. They're worked to death. They don't make enough money. They're mad. They're stressed out all the time, and trying to have to worry about politics too. It is so hard. We have to do a better job of educating folks to these things, but it is challenging because lies just spread like wildfire. And I think people are going to figure that out, though, because they can't hide behind what's going to happen to the country. It's just a matter of time before all this crashes. Like Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, they're in there. They cut taxes on the rich. Everything goes up for a while, and then it crashes. And then Clinton comes in, and he's a moderate Democrat that has a lot of financial, centrist about him, fixes things back up, start going good again. George W. Bush comes in there, cuts taxes on the wealthy again, goes up for a while, crashes. Obama, same as Clinton, goes in, goes up again. Then Trump goes in, cuts taxes. What happens? It crashes. This happens every single time. And it's just a matter of time before people realize that the things that he's trying to sell you, Mexico isn't paying for the wall.
No,
it's not going to work. Same time, second time around, it's going to be exact same thing. So I'm sitting back and watching, Nevin. I got my popcorn, man. He's got the presidency. He's got the House. He's got the Senate. They're already talking about all the executive action that he's going to be taking. He's got the Supreme Court. Like, they are going to lay ruin to this country. You're going to see authoritarianism that we have never experienced before. In old times, they would probably call it fascism. And I'm going to sit back, and the people that are going to get hit the hardest by it are the poor. It's going to be the people that have the least. And that's the one of his biggest bases right there. These are not the ultra wealthy that he's pulling over. These are just normal workers that have so very little, and they're going to find out the hard way what this second Trump presidency is gonna do. And then the pendulum will swing back the other way. And Nevin, I just hope at some point we realize from our mistakes that if you vote for this side or if you vote for that side, as long as they're being paid by the same groups, you're never going to have real change.
Yeah, and I probably one of the first things that, if the Democratic Party changes along the lines that you and I desire, the first thing they should tackle, to be perfectly honest, is a couple of things. The money in speech through a congressional resolution overriding the Supreme Court, or, I hate to say it, and people will criticize me for saying this, but you had people like President Andrew Jackson, who said about Justice Marshall, and this was concerned the war against American Indian nations. This is not a good thing necessarily. But he said, what army does Justice Marshall have? And I think sometimes we may have to ignore the Supreme Court, because we have to think in terms of dictatorship by Federalist Society judges that are working in behest of special plutocratic interests and ideological interests. And they are preventing good policies that would revivify our representative republic and our free enterprise capitalist system. And that's a problem. We have to think in terms that the judicial majority in the Supreme Court are acting like a dictatorship over the United States and over policy making, if you will. Because many of their decisions, if you were to poll the American people, and we look at even the state votes that have occurred in Missouri, Florida in the past, overwhelmingly pro minimum wage, pro labor unions, pro this, pro that for everyday business people, workers, and consumers. So they are literally going against the popular will of the people and policies that you and I would agree with. So I would seriously think, and there has to be a good president, a good communicator who was like FDR, who was able to communicate that these people are using the notions of freedom and liberty really to establish their own soft dictatorship, where sure, we can go in the streets and dissent, and we can have these shows and discuss it, and we could demonstrate, and thank God for that, but our wishes are not put into policy. They don't translate into policy. So we just make noise, but nothing comes of it. That's the type of de facto dictatorship that we live in. And I don't like calling, it's not to say we're a dictatorship like Saudi Arabia or Russia or Cuba or Venezuela. Not that at all. It's what Sheldon Wolin has termed inverted totalitarianism, where you had basically a private sector oligarchy running the country. And it's true. And I first learned of this, of course, when, ironically, through my anti-communism and my anti-fascism, where you have two anti-capitalist movements funded by the very capitalists that they wanted to either control or shoot or both. So that's how I see that. So I would deal with the money in politics through at least congressional resolution. I would ban stock buybacks. That's something that the executive can do. That will free up a lot of money. I would also take a look at every form of deregulation and finance. Graham Leach Bliley, which got rid of Glass-Steagall, getting rid of the uptick rule. The law that was passed in the 1980s that deregulated the savings and loans industry. President Clinton's Commodities Futures Modernization Act of 2000, which deregulated and really created the derivatives industry. I would take a hard look, and a lot of that I would repeal, much of that deregulation. In the financial sector in particular, I would get rid of right to work. I would repeal Section 14B. Those are the things I would do immediately. Tariffs are a tricky issue. To me, we need to get many of these sectors back. The world is a hostile place. China, Russia is unreliable. The war in Ukraine affected our markets because of importing oil and other fuels from Russia. That's a problem. If there's a global war that happens, we're in big trouble. That interrupts our supply chain, just like COVID. When you have these loss of industries, you also lose talent. You also lose the capacity to innovate because you no longer have the factory floors that you can perform these innovations on. That's a problem. We all know what it did, deindustrialization did to communities. Now, tariffs are one tip at the tentacle of reindustrializing the United States. I think you brought up an excellent point. We should really, Joe Biden continued and even increased Trump's tariffs, and I think that's a good thing. Biden had done very well at the FTC with Lina Khan. Give a thumbs up to Lina Khan, who has prevented, and God knows, in 40 years, the mergers and acquisitions craze. And we all know that Wall Street is just salivating. You hear it on CNBC, salivating about the possibility of her, despite J.D. Vance supporting her publicly, at least in the campaign, she's probably going to be fired or her contract or her term not renewed. I'd be shocked if Trump kept her, but I don't think he will. Because his populism is full of shit. Pardon my language. I'm just going to say it. And I agreed with 25% of stuff he did, but the other 75% no. And much of his economic program was terrible and a severe disappointment for me. First thing Trump did, one of the first things he did, by the way, a little fun trivia, I think he got rid of the tax deduction for people who take mortgage insurance, if I recall correctly. I'd have to look that up, but I remember reading it, and I'm like, oh my God, he's governing just like, your typical Tea Party, quote unquote, free market libertarian. Whenever somebody says free market, look, I like as much free market and less regulation and taxes as much as an ideal. Well, we live in the real world, and it is necessary. So I just leave that. But when free market is used, it's like social justice. Watch out, hold your wallet. because that means free market. When somebody says free market, that means just business can do whatever they want, employers can do whatever they want, and they have absolute power. That's what that means. It's buzzwords. Just like if a fascist or a communist talks about social justice, don't trust them. It's usually a double meaning to the term. So that's what I would do. With the tariffs, I would slowly raise them, and you would need a bipartisan political will to do this. I would do over a period of 5 to 10 years, 25%. But there needs to be done a lot more. We need to, I would argue for free tuition for public colleges and universities and trade schools for majors like chemistry, engineering, biology, various trades like welding, for example, and a whole teachers, things that will allow us to redevelop and nurture again that talent, that human capital that is needed to restart industries. I would also either nationalize the Federal Reserve and convert it in good Alexander Hamilton style to the Third National Bank, or recreate what Herbert Hoover and later Roosevelt had, which was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, that will pump tremendous amounts of credit, whether loans or grants, to existing manufacturing enterprises in critical sectors, or to restart entirely dormant industries that no longer exist. And it's going to be expensive, and people will say, how are we going to pay for it? Well, we gave billions, if not a couple of $1 trillion to Wall Street under Obama and Bush as a result of TARP. And look where that got us. Under Obama and continuing to this present day, you had private equity buying an increasing share of distressed homes, starting under Obama. So that's what happens when you give TARP to investment and commercial banking. And I am for a robust investment in commercial banking sector, but that's besides the point. And then what I would do is also I would slowly close the Buy American law loopholes for government contracting. And I can't stress enough how getting rid of stock buybacks will help. Make that illegal, companies will then be incentivized, to put it mildly, or forced by law to pump money. I'm not saying not to their shareholders. You want a stock market, you want a Wall Street. I'm not interested in getting rid of that. But that money will also, a large portion of that money will then be redirected into hiring as long as the company does well, pay raises as long as the company is profitable, new factories, new plants, new office buildings, etc. That's what I would do. So I think you're right about the tariff part. And I think that's where Trump is right and wrong. What Trump doesn't understand is, I think he does, I just don't think he cares. And he's surrounded by some good people, but many people that are not so good, policy-wise. Just slapping on immediately next year a 10% tariff and everything is not going to speed up the reindustrialization. There needs to be a crash program for national security reasons, too. I mean, we see an ICB, intercontinental, or might have been an intermediate range ballistic missile that was fired at Ukraine. What if there's a war? What are we going to do? I mean, I'm not saying this. I'm quoting people, but generals since the 1980s have said that we cannot fight a prolonged war against the Soviet Union because we lost, even under Reagan, quite a bit of our industrial base. Even Trump's own Defense Department issued a report in 2019 which blamed financialization of industry and trade policies, amongst other things. Not as so much regulation, mainly, if I recall, a lot of it financialization and trade policies, free trade policies that have decimated our defense industry. Did you know, Charles, it was recently in 2023, there was a report indicating that the defense companies, the contractors, are investing most of their profits not in R&D or new weapons development, but in stock buybacks. Get rid of stock buybacks, please. President can do it through the SEC. Reagan didn't need a vote in Congress to get rid of it. I rest my case.
Yeah, but he'll never do it because he's beholden to those corporations. And you are correct. It is a cheat code to create artificial scarcity for their stock so they don't have to do the work. They don't have to innovate. They don't have to do a good job. They can just buy back their own stock. But yeah, what do we need to do? We need to adopt a true populist message. The tariffs, all this negative ramifications for things, I think that's the wrong way to look at it. The most powerful thing in the world is the government of the United States. We need to incentivize making things here in the United States in the same way that we did with the CHIPS Act. We can do that with any industry that we want to. We can subsidize it. And that can mean the prices will come down on it. You can create more competition. But the big corporations, they don't want to do that. Walmart doesn't want to have to compete with those other places. They want to be able to buy their stuff for China on the cheap. You also need to embrace messaging like scrapping the cap on Social Security. People that have benefited the most from the system should have no problem paying back more into it. If you have CEO to median worker pay, you should have a tiered tax system on that. If you get over 20%, taxes should go up on those CEOs, 30% even higher, 40% even higher. That incentivizes them to pay their workers better. Populist messaging. If you have federal contracts that our corporations are giving and you're outsourcing that work and you're sending it overseas, you should not have those federal contracts anymore. You should lose them. We should punish people that are doing things wrong, and we should reward people that are doing things right. That is just basic common sense. But we don't want to do that because the people that are running these things that are behind all of the money are making a killing. So all they want us to do is be mad at other poor people to not notice the fact that these billionaires, these oligarchs, these uber wealthy people, the behind the scenes people are just getting away with murder every single day.
Yeah, literally. And I think that's very well stated. So where does organized labor go from here? What can organized labor do to get the message out, to nurture this true populism?
So we did organize under Trump. It was hard. Anytime that there is a push against something, there is always a counter push. There's always that force that's trying to overcome the obstacle, because Trump is going to be very anti-labor. He's going to do his best to continue to destroy unions. And the only answer to organized greed is organized labor. I'm not on the organizing side, but there's a lot of young, energetic folks, and there's a lot of seasoned folks as well that I know are planning this every single day. And they do it by talking to people one-on-one. They get out there and they explain to them that if you organize, you will have X, Y, and Z, where right now you don't have any of those things. It will give you a seat at the table. You'll be able to discuss your working conditions. You'll have collective power. We're always stronger when we're together. And I think that's the message that won't die with labor. It's just the fact that strength comes from the many. When we have solidarity, we do better. It's entire world history, right? So that's where my hope for the future comes from, is that it's never been easy for organized labor. I didn't get into this job because I thought it was going to be easy. I got into it because it's the right thing to do. You help people. You stick up for people that don't have power. You don't like bullies. You fight back against them. And I don't think people that believe that will ever go away, no matter how hard it gets.
Well, I think that's what unites you and I, Charles, personally. I don't like powerful people bullying others, whether it's a totalitarian collectivist government or the fascism or communism, and committing aggressions throughout the world and bullying their people and whatnot on site. But I also don't like when you have powerful people in the private sector in the United States bullying people as well. I don't like corruption, whether it comes from labor, whether it comes from business, whether it comes from government. I don't like it. I like checks and balances. I'm in a sense, I'm an institutionalist in that way, because I want to reform things and make better things, improve circumstances in this country. You know, I don't want to totally despoil the wealth and the wealthy and the billionaires, but they also have to sacrifice too as well, because it's going to look better for them. If they pay more people, people are going to have more faith in the system. They're going to think the American dream continues, and that de-radicalizes people. And that de-radicalized people after the Great Depression up until about the 1980s. And then there are pockets of radicalism that came out based on economics. Like in the 1980s, you had the Lyndon LaRouche movement, for example, the National Caucus of Labor Committees. You have Occupy Wall Street. You had little spurts of the neo-Nazi movement. You have the Democratic Socialist America growing to at least 40 to 50,000 people. You know, there's a reason for that. Why do people join these movements? Because a large chunk of it has to do with economics, and that they realize that the American dream is rapidly eroding, you know, decade after decade. And that's not me stating, that's studies, that's interviews, that's even me talking to political radicals. I've had neo-fascists contact me because of books that I read, which are very anti-Nazi, but I write books like The Theory and Practice of the Nazi War Against Capitalism, or you know, this, that. The name of my program, you know, was The Patriotic Populist. So some of these people were to reach out. They didn't know I was Jewish, and look, and gay family members that I love, and a non-white Hispanic woman that I'm in a relationship with. But I asked these people, well, why do you join these movements? You know, to a communist who used to be a communist, who was a friend of mine until he passed away young. His name is Kenny. Asked him. Other radicals of different stripes, it's all economics. They see that capitalism and representative republic form of government is not working for them, their families, no matter how hard they work and play by the rules. And that's what happens. So my appeal to billionaires is what Charles and I are recommending. It's actually in your long-term interests. But the problem is they are deaf and dumb to that. There's a very good tell-all article. I've read it on this program many times. Sam Polk, who was a investor, hedge fund trader, and he was very successful. He wrote a tell-all article in the New York Times, I think it was like 2013, 2014. And he basically mentioned the same things you and I are mentioning: stabilizing the financial industry by having common sense regulations put back. And the way he recalled it is his bosses just gave him this withering look. And they said to him, look, we don't have the brain capacity to think about it. It's just, we're thinking about the here and the now and what's good for the company and the shareholders, and they just don't care. Even though they have the power to care, they don't. There is a lack of concern and empathy, basically, according to Polk. Their brains were not configured. And there's a lot of other stories too about a lot of greed, a lot of fraud. You know, you had Goldman Sachs executives and traders have talked about that too as well, and tell-all articles and whistleblowers and whatnot. But that's the problem. You and I, our solutions de-radicalize people. And what we're calling for ultimately is going to preserve the interests of the wealthy long term against the pitchforks, which is the ironic thing, if you think about it. And we just got to keep on educating people on this. But it's hard, especially with conservatives and libertarians. Some of them get it. I've talked to them, and you have ones that are open-minded that get it. But others, it's hard. ideology is a religion to some people, I think. And they might mean well, but by God, questioning their ideology or new information, it's hard. I don't know if I told you this, Charles, and then we'll do some closing comments. I was a libertarian economically. I was a member of the John Birch Society for a few years. Yeah, that's an interesting, we could talk about that another time. I know you're shocked. You learn something new about me every day, about the host here. But how did I change somewhat my economic views? Ironically, it was through conservative and dissident libertarian authors. Donald McIlvaney, who was the publisher of the McIlvaney Intelligence Advisor. He wrote reports in the late 1980s, one from 1987. I could send it to you if you want through your email, if I could find it, where it punched a hole in Reaganomics. And he's a libertarian free market gold standard guy, but at least he was honest and laid out substantial evidence to show that under Reagan, there really wasn't prosperity around the corner. That really the Rust Belt was getting very rusty under Reagan, and he documented it very well. And he's a hardcore Christian conservative who's JBS adjacent. You had William R. Hawkins and Anthony Harrigan. They wrote articles and chapters and books throughout the 1980s, and they went against things like leverage buyouts and Reagan's trade policies, which were generally very free trade. And they talked about the mounting deficits and the effect on the economy and how we weren't producing even then critical goods needed for a war effort for, say, against the Soviet Union. So I started to read all these different people, and one thing led to another, and I'm like, because it was a conservative and a John Birch Society adjacent free market gold standard guy, and more of a nationalist Hamiltonian type or Teddy Roosevelt kind of conservatives like Hawkins and Harrigan, and the information they presented it in a conservative package. And I said, wait a minute, this is not working. Something's wrong. And there were other things that I personally saw too as well. Deindustrialization. I'm from New York. I saw that a lot of conservatives in New York, like institutions like the Manhattan Institute, they were actually taking the side for the eviction of vital port and industrial plants and facilities from New York. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I thought the conservatives were for American power and, free enterprise and making money by producing great products and all the rest of it, like heavy industry. And I'm like, wait a minute. And it just, over the span of many years, it started to percolate in my brain. And it started to make me change. And I think we just have to try and talk to as many libertarians and just celebrate the ones that are open-minded, that are amenable to the facts and the arguments we present, and not to get too discouraged by the individual libertarians and conservatives that are hostile to our view, closed-minded to our view. You can tell when they sometimes make arguments. Sometimes I don't even like making counter arguments because it's like you have to explain a different reality to them. Have you ever tried to talk to somebody who has a totally different version of reality on economics? Have you ever tried to have those conversations? It's not fun.
Yeah, it's extremely challenging because cognitive dissonance is a real thing. It's quite literally almost impossible to hold a contrary opinion that you have in your head. Once you believe something, it becomes so difficult to believe something contrary to what you think that you know. And that's why we just have to keep educating people and talking it through. And I am certain that the only way to lose an enemy is to make a friend. So every person I meet is my superior in some way. And if I approach a conversation with them with that in mind, I can learn from them. And if I think that they're a dumb piece of crap that can't tell me anything, that does stupid things, there's nothing that I can gain from speaking to them. The ocean places itself below all things, and that's why all rivers flow into it. We have to be humble in this because that's what teachers do.
Exactly, you have to, and you have to have patience with certain people. People they're going to disagree with, and some of them people that are very nice that I'm friendly with, and that's fine. And you just got to nurture that. Absolutely, humility is very important. You know, you and I don't know everything. We don't have all the answers. My view is look, sometimes the conservatives are right, sometimes the liberals are right. You have to look at the record of the policies. And you have to look and see, is it going to make the rich richer? Is it going to make the poor richer? Is it going to make the middle class richer? Is it going to make the country more secure? Those policies fulfill those different functions. A more perfect union, to quote former President Abraham Lincoln, then I'm generally for that. Then I'll be amenable to those policies. So that's how I look at it. Do you have any closing comments or closing observations regarding the election and the path forward?
The only thing that I would say, because it's going to be hard, this is going to be challenging. You remember those 4 years where we woke up every single morning and would say, what kind of crazy crap was said today, and it was stressful. But anytime things get tough, I remind myself that A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters for 12 years fought with the Pullman Company for union recognition, and they voluntarily were paying dues for 12 years. So I don't have it that bad. I can do this for sure. And we're links in a chain in the labor movement. And as long as we stick together, we will get through this.
Well, look, the Amazon labor union started under Trump in Staten Island in New York under the first Trump administration.
Great point.
I mean, so we rest our case. So look, it's going to be a very difficult period for labor, for workers, for middle classes, for even small and medium-sized businesses. It's going to be tough for federal government workers and their unions, as you know. So this, I think, presents an opportunity for real militants, not only in private sector workers, but frankly, public sector workers under siege. Not as much the state and local governments, but it's definitely the federal government. So we have to wait and see. We really have to wait and see. But I think this presents new opportunities to rebalance things. Because I have a feeling organized labor is not going without a fight. I cannot see Sean Fain. I cannot see people like Sean Fain and Sean O'Brien, the Amazon Labor Union, many other unions. Look at the International Longshoremen's Association that was already striking. Then, of course, that ended. More and more and more and more, there are things going on in labor. Down here in the South, based in Alabama, I mean, they're way more to the left of me politically, but they still bring important labor news as the Valley Labor Report on YouTube. You might want to reach out to them, Charles. Okay. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're on YouTube. So I think you should link up with them. I think that would be a good opportunity for the cause of organized labor, kind of unite North and South, if you will.
I'll check them out.
I will send you the YouTube link, and I think probably you can reach out. I think they do call-in shows too as well. So if you have a hard time getting in touch with them, you could probably call in and just say who you are or something, But that program started very recently. So there are moves in the right direction. And I'm a member of my union, proudly. You work for a union. So just got to get the word out there. And when I renewed my membership to the union, I wrote on the survey form that I would like to get involved in union organizing and educational efforts on the importance of unions. So I'm in the process of trying to make a tentative Zoom meeting date with one of the union leaders in this state. We'll see how it goes, but something I'm interested in. I certainly can speak reasonably intelligently about this.
I concur, my friend. It's always good to get to talk to you.
Always great talking with you. Thank you so much, Charles, for all your insights, your opinions, all the hard work you're doing in fighting for everyday Americans. You do a great job. You're a great family man, too. I love the photos on Facebook. Love the cooking.
Thank you.
And whatnot.
Oh, thanks, brother.
Send some of that cooking down here, by the way.
Anytime. I need to come visit you. It's about to be winter, man. I need to come down your way.
Oh, I'd love to have you down here. Love to have you. So anyways, so thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for listening to the program. Be kind to each other. God bless America. God bless you all. Have a great weekend.